measuring safety. What we will be discussing tonight is some parts of the safety management system that are linked to performance measurement. And I think what is really important is to understand how can we measure something that is intangible, which is safety. Safety is intangible. We can feel it, we can somehow pronounce it and define it, but it's very hard to measure safety. So this is something that we will try to figure out tonight and see how are we able to do actually measurements and what indicators can we use to measure safety and then also track safety so we can avoid potential accidents. So those are the two challenges that we face. Then we'll look at monitoring safety performance. So once we have a system in place, we need to monitor it. We need to make sure that we are on track. So that's basically what we are going to look at today. Now, before we can get started with that, I would like just to give you a brief introduction on basically what we are talking about and where the safety performance indicators, targets, measurement fit into our world of the safety management system. Basically, it's the Swiss cheese model where we have protective barriers because we believe that these barriers will actually avoid accidents. Now, you could say, well, if we have these barriers in place, we can measure whether the barriers do hold, and so we can measure that. Yeah, agreed. However, we need to make sure that we have an idea how these different barriers are connected to each other and how these different barriers actually do prevent accidents. Now, barriers, we can define them, but how do we measure whether a barrier is a good barrier or a bad barrier, whether the barrier that we define is effective? Now, that being said, we have a starting point, barriers, based on our risk analysis to identify the area where we could actually start to measure. So this is why we have this in place. Now, when we start out with an operation, we define the operation as it should be. And that means we have a baseline performance, meaning that, well, every time I prepare a flight, I will do A, B, C, and D, and to a certain level of detail. Now, obviously, humans tend to try to optimize things. So they try to make shortcuts to make it faster, quicker. Sometimes the process is not clearly defined, so they actually bridge the gap to make sense out of the process. That actually deviates from the baseline performance as we have imagined. Now, this is what you can see here on the right-hand side. So we deviate from our baseline performance. And once we do that, actually we run the risk of, producing accidents. So if we don't understand the finer details and if we are not able to measure if we deviate and how much we deviate from our baseline performance, sooner or later an accident will happen. Now, given that, as I said in the beginning, the company is run by people, we have the issue that only can keep together the patchwork of imperfect technologies, production pressures, goal conflicts, and resource constraints, okay? And what we also have to understand that rules and procedures never can and never will provide that, okay? It's always going to be an imperfect world, especially smaller operators, because they're not able to get into that amount of detail to define the processes. So there will be decision-making required, and each person, each pilot or task specialist will decide differently. This is what we call problem of mission creep. Now, what we have to do, as you know, when we set up a safety management system, we have to define the baseline performance. And also we need to find a way how to measure deviations from the baseline performance. And that's basically is what we're going to talk about in the next half hour or so. So with the mission creep, we have to ask, how do the holes in the Swiss cheese appear? Okay. Now, based on the slide that I just showed you, okay, the baseline performance is the work as imagined. And it refers to these assumptions, how a perfect pilot will do something, how a perfect dispatcher will prepare a flight, okay? Now, that's how it should be done. But then there is obviously, as we all know, the difference to work as done. And that's actually how it is done, okay? Either in a specific case or on a routine basis, because that's just the way people do it, because they have found it to be more efficient. Now, that can be problematic or not, depending on how you sharpen your pencil. Yeah, that's maybe a quite obscure way how you do it, but it may not have an impact at all. The solution is basically to understand what determines how the work is done, and then we can define the differences, and we can then also find out is that gap significant to that. Okay, this is how much away from baseline performance we are. So when we go back to our pre-flight planning, we know we have to do steps 1, A, B, C, and D. Now, if we continuously find that step B always lacks 1 step, and steps 3 also is not done properly, and we already have identified 2 parts, 2 processes that are not done as imagined, but done differently. Now, that gives us the first idea. But in order to do that, we have to actually understand what the process means and how, what the people are actually doing. So we need to go out and observe them to understand if there is a gap at all. Now, you know, one of the questions that we still have to ask is, are we able to measure that, quantify that? So let's say we do an analysis, and you have like a checklist that the pilot has to sign, and we have the checklist of all the points that the pilot has to do, but then we actually compare that to the flight preparation that he has done. We can see that there is a deviation. And then also what we have to ask is, are we able to quantify the performance of work as imagined? This means, are we able to say the pre-flight planning is 100% complete if conditions A, B, C, and D are fulfilled? If not, if one condition is not fulfilled, it's 75%. If a second condition is not fulfilled, it's 50%. So we need to be able to change. We need to be able to measure that and define how it is to be measured. Now that leads to the last point in the yellow part here. Can we measure work as done? And here we have, again, a question that we need to follow up in the next few minutes. So when we look at the safety management system, where are safety performance indicators and safety performance target defined? That's part of the safety assurance element, which is right here, okay? Now, when we look at at the, the safety management system as a whole, we have stated objectives to ensure continuous improvement. Now, that's the reason why we are actually doing this, because we don't know if we are getting better or worse if we don't have a target and if we don't have something to measure. So everybody could think that everything is going great, but actually things are deteriorating without us knowing. So we need to have these objectives, we need to have these indicators in order to make sure that we are on track. So in this safety assurance part, okay, there obviously is quality assurance, which is focused on processes. That's documentation, auditing, managing review. But actually the question is, are we actually measuring safety with this? That's the official description from the ICAO Safety Management Manual. But then you have to wonder, well, how can we quantify this? How can we make it more in a logical, structured way? If I just review the manuals once, I do not have this kind of continuous input from data that I need to make sure that I understand what's going on. Imagine you measure your pulse once, it's at 65, which is great, okay? So you imagine that's great, so you won't check your pulse for another year. Now, then you see that your pulse is 90 continuously. What has happened? Well, we don't know. We just measure, we just have two data points, 65 and 90. Now, 90, we do have an issue. We need to change. So basically, we could have prevented to go up to 90 if we had measured more continuously. And if we had said, well, the pulse is a good indicator for stability of the operation of our body, say, okay? Now, we define what we measure, and we say, what is the effect of that indicator? What do we measure? So we measure stability with that indicator. And if it goes above 80, then we have an issue. So there you can see we already have everything in place that we need for the safety assurance part to make sure that what we have originally defined is maintained. So, safety, why are we doing that? I mean, I touched upon this already a bit, but when we measure safety, at the same time, we identify the top safety risks. That is either from internal reporting or from risk databases that we have access to. And we also, based on our experience, will look forward and try to predict what could be the worst thing that can happen to us and how can we prevent that. All of this is not possible without having any indication what a safe operation is, or what's the likelihood of a major event will be. So when we have these top safety risks, we need to be able to see, do we have any kind of protective barriers that we need to put in place so they can be avoided. And if we have these safety barriers, we can also then see if we can actually quantify these safety barriers. Meaning, if we have a safety barrier in place that breaches at pulse 80, for example, well, then we know it's not that much different. It's not from our most catastrophic event. We're able to actually stop the trend and do changes in the organization. Then also we have to define what we want to achieve with this kind of safety management system. Obviously, there's always the trade-off between investing in safety, making processes more rigid, more structured, also more burdensome versus being able to earn money. Now, in order to be able to address clients' needs, we need to be flexible to their demands. Now, there's the trade-off. So if we have a very structured and rigid organization, we're not able to capture the client's needs. And then basically we're not able to earn any money and we will finally go under. On the other hand, if we just follow the client's needs, well, we're not looking at safety really, and eventually an accident will happen and that might cost more, or actually the company will go under. So if we measure and if we do this, then we have a system in place, an early warning. And this is exactly what we have in a cockpit: a fuel gauge, turbine outlet temperature. We have the attitude indicator. All these measurements give us a clear indication where we are, and they all serve a purpose because we know if we breach a parameter, we know what potentially could happen. And the same thing happens with safety performance indicators and measuring these safety issues. All right. Now, along with that, we identify also other information that we need to make a decision. Now, let's go back to our pulse example. All right, so we now know that the pulse is above 80. Now, once the trigger is breached, we need to understand what other information we need in order to make an informed decision. Well, let's say you've just done a 5-mile run. Well, obviously the pulse is above 80. That's no problem. So we have to see and combine the pure information with context. So we need to understand that if we measure the pulse after a run, it will be higher. If we measure the pulse after the run, it should be lower. It should be within a certain range. Now, that will help us to identify and quantify the triggers that we are looking at. Now, that's a crucial thing, and it will be important when you set up your triggers and the associated actions. So that's why we measure safety and we put this system in place. ICAO defines this process as follows. They have a graphic in there. Now, here we have this safety data collection and processing system, okay? And when you look at that safety performance management part, it's actually, you break it down quite simple. You define your safety objectives, you define your safety performance indicators that you believe will actually measure the, some action or process or data in your organization that will actually that will help you to obtain the safety objectives. And you measure the safety performance and you make any kind of changes if you're not on track. That is linked to the safety promotion part in your safety management system. So any indication or any knowledge that you gain from that process, communicated to participants, to the company, to employees, and also to management. Then on this side, you have the safety and risk analysis part. So any indications from there flow into that part of the management system, the safety management system, and you then actually review your risk analysis. You review the outcome, the potential outcome, and you review the likelihood that this will happen. So you actually go through that and you might come out with different risks or different risk categorizations. And you can see here, these arrows are both bidirectional, okay? So this is an exchange process. Now, this sounds all very good, but actually, how are we going to implement it? Well, we can actually run through these phases right here, through these steps, okay? And we have to have a safety library available as part of our, hazard and risk management that we continuously update. So this is a conscious process that we can do. You can see here you have the 3 of the 4 elements for a safety management system here on one page: the safety promotion part, safety assurance, and hazard and risk management. So that's one thing that I struggle the most when I talk about safety management systems. And believe me, I do not have I don't have a lot of answers. I do have some. But with regards to safety, the biggest question is, if we have a metric, if we have something that we can measure, how can we link it to a safety outcome? What do I mean with that? Well, when I measure how many safety audits I have performed during the year, is that really an indicator, a metric where I can say, okay, if I do 10 safety audits, safety will be higher. Okay, if I do 20 safety audits, well, logically, safety should even be higher. Now, the question that we have to ask is the number of safety audits a metric to predict safety? That's the biggest question that we have to ask. What metrics have a direct link to safe outcomes? Obviously, we have operational metrics, we have safety management processes that we can quantify, but then we have to see and try to get the link done to the accidents and occurrences. Okay, now when we look at an accident report, we have the root cause. Okay, now what we can ask basically is, well, when we look at the root cause, could we have measured something that would have told us in advance that this might be happening? Okay, now that is obviously quite difficult, and the link, the causal link, is not always there. So that's the hardest part. So it's really difficult to say from an accident, yes, this is the case. Obviously, there's easy ones. If you see that, if you have like a lot of, if you look at the oil, the spectral analysis of your engines, and you detect a lot of chips, then you obviously know that something is not right with your engine. We do have a correlation there. So if the engine fails due to excessive wear, well, then it's clear that if we measure the quality of the oil, that we would have detected that. But most of the time, it's not that simple, because the human, the human element is there, and the person is actually committing error. So that is much more difficult to understand. Generally, if we talk about indicators, and if we want to get something out of this, what we can say is, if we have more activity, we have more safety-related events. Well, that's a no-brainer, obviously, but it's true. So if you don't fly, you don't have any flying accidents. If you fly a lot, you will have a lot of, not a lot, but you will have safety-related events. So that's certain. So basically, that also means that the more data you have, okay, the more likely you will be able to detect something that is linked to safety. The second hypothesis is, well, more demographics, meaning more people interaction, more people involved, you will have more safety-related events. If you think about the production of a car nowadays, that's almost fully automated. So you do not have any safety-related events. If it's handcrafted, you work with heavy machinery, there typically is more safety-related events. So whenever humans come into play, there will be more safety-related events. And also, the more SMS activity you have, the closer you look at what is happening and how things are done, the more safety-related events you will detect, okay? Because a lot of things actually are done when we look at our baseline performance and our mission creep. Well, then we can see that if we have a lot of activity that is not observed, well, people will do shortcuts. They will actually make things easier for them. And then they will not be able to, most of the time it will be okay. But actually, it's not according to the baseline performance. And if we actually look closely, we would detect that deviation and announce it. So that would be safety-related events. Less safety-related events, because we do detect more deviations and therefore less safety-related events, because we're able to correct faster. Sorry about that. Okay. Good. Now, if you have any clear way forward with this, if you have a crystal ball and you're able to do this, then you're absolutely top of the game. But this is actually the hardest part of this whole thing, because that's that relationship, the metric and the outcome. That's the issue that for which I, unfortunately, do not have a clear answer. All right, so then let's go. Let's start with the process. When we look at the ICAO SMM process, we define safety objectives. They are high-level statements of safety achievements and desired outcomes. Okay, now they actually guide our actions. They guide our decisions, and it's a high-level safety commitment. So we want to have safety. It's part of the safety policy, obviously, but it's important so everyone understands in the company what we want to achieve and what our guiding principles are. Now, that's the strategic direction we need from the safety objective. If we go a bit further, if we actually go a step deeper, a level deeper with the safety objectives, well, then we have to see, well, if we have the safety objective of providing everyone with the required protective equipment to do their job, okay, well, then that has a number of consequences that we have to follow through. And if you define safety objectives, they may be process-oriented or outcome-oriented. So meaning we have a safe behavior, meaning we put on our safety, the personal safety, protective safety equipment. So we put that on, and that will then allow us to do the processes more safely because we have the protective equipment on. At the same time, we need to make sure that we are able to do that process in our protective equipment. If it's outcome oriented, then we are looking at a certain target level that we want to achieve. And we say if we ever go below 90%, then actually we need to do something. So you could say it's a negative target or a positive target. The positive target would be we actually have more than 80% of this, okay? And if you have 85%, you're better than your target level. So that's outcome oriented. So, good. Now, based on these objectives, you can then define what the indicators should be. How do we measure? And I said that again, you know, relates back to what we discussed before. How can we define indicator metrics that actually have an outcome or an influence that actually measure safety? Now, typically we can say that we prefer qualitative over quantitative. We have quantitative indicators. They actually are related to numbers. So we are able to collect them, and we're also able to collect them in big numbers. The more measurements we have, the better, because that will give us more information that we can then process. Qualitative indicators are more based on personal feedback. It's subjective. It might provide you with good background information as to the reason why something has happened, or just generally on the general happiness. You know, are people satisfied? Then the question is, how satisfied are they? Can you quantify that? If not, you have qualitative indicators that you can use to do this. Typically, you will have these two means combined. It's not possible just to do quantitative measurements, because you will lack context. You will not understand why certain criteria are the way they are. So you need to understand more behind some of these indicators. Now, when we look at performance indicators, we also look at the quantitative indicators. We do have leading and lagging indicators. So when we measure, we have, you know, the bird strike issues, you know, the process to prevent bird strikes. We do have a leading indicators where we say, okay, well, there's been a certain number of scaring activities, and if that is actually increased, then we will have to intervene and do something. If we mow the grass, you know, those are things that we can identify and we can actually measure. So if you're on an airport and you get feedback the grass is mown, or you have done some crops control, that will give you feedback on the likelihood of bird activity. Now, there's our lagging indicators, which is actually looking backwards. So then we look at actual bird strikes. We look at bird ingestions into the turbine. When has that happened? Why does it happen? So these indicators, we both measure them. So we measure the number of bird scaring activities before actually something has happened, and we can measure the bird strikes after they have happened. It both will give us an indication and give us a number, but they are in a different context. So before we can actually do the leading indicators, we need to understand the lagging indicators and derive measurements, additional indicators that actually can be leading indicators. Because right now, if we are at the current situation, we first need to understand what has happened, and only then we're able to do the predictive part. Again, coming back to the slide where I said, what metric do I use that will indicate safety? Okay. So how can we do them? And obviously, there's a number of examples out there, but you would have to, if you have your own safety management system, you will have to review and check them to make sure that they actually suit your operation and that they work. So so they should be related to the safety objective. Okay. So if you want to, if your objective is to protect your workers from any bodily harm, you need to have indicators that will actually measure, see whether that has been achieved. It has to be available data, and you need to be able to measure it reliably. It should be specific and quantifiable, then realistic as well, and especially for smaller operators, that is an issue, because can you measure? There's only that much resource available that you have, and also you need to be able to measure it and analyze it, and it should not be too much effort because you have other things to do. So rather start small and then expand on the next level. If you use a safety performance indicator, I would suggest that you actually define the safety performance indicator. So somewhere in your safety management system, you can say, well, we measure A, that's our safety performance indicator, and you describe what it measures. So other people can understand what's the reasoning for selecting that safety indicator is. It's like a list. It's a description. What's the purpose? How do we measure it? What are the units of measurement on another measurement? Responsible. How should it be collected? And how often do we collect it? And that is often forgotten. If you look at that, people start saying, "Oh yeah, let's measure safety," but they don't really think about how often do we need to measure it. Again, coming back to our pulse example, if we only measure once a year, we might not be able to capture a trend that has happened in the meantime. So some examples, and obviously that is a starting point, but that's something that you can and should be able to measure. So have you received feedback? Okay. What is the feedback? And the quantitative part, how many people have received training in safety management? How many number of audits have you performed? Have you been able to do all the audits that you planned? Are there safety reports? Is there proactive input from your employees, from your customers regarding safety? And then also a metric could be, how much time does it take for our organization to make a change? So if we detect something that is unsafe, how long does it take the organization to implement a change to a safer procedure? If we're able to change quickly, we will potentially be able to reduce any future hazards once we identify a risk, because we're able to adapt quickly. And if we're not able to do that, we have to understand why. Because being able to react to a safety or to a hazard is also important. So there should be a certain time defined. How much time is okay? What is too much? So, I mean, if you look at that list, that's probably something that you could start with. But obviously, it's not enough. There needs to be more. Now, once you have the indicators and you define what they measure, well, you need to say then, well, what should be the target? So if we have these trainings of our staff, what should be the target? Should the target be 100% once a year? Should it be twice a year? Should it be a regular course? And okay, if 70% of our people do the course, that's the target. So now we are able to measure something, and then we have to define what do we want to achieve. That's the short and medium term safety performance management. Yeah? So they allow us to see whether we're on course or not. Now, when you look at the safety performance target, you obviously see that setting targets is also quite hard. And setting targets will have an influence on the behavior of people. Why do I say that? Well, just imagine if you say our target is to have 30 safety reports this year, okay? Or we want to increase the number of safety reports by 15% this year. Now, that's a target. The question is, when you actually achieve that, does it really measure safety? So you have reached 30 safety reports per year. Great job, okay? Target achieved. But what does it tell you? Now, is 30 reports safe? But if they would have reported 40 reports, well, then you could ask, well, a safety report is something that is obviously something that has been detected by one of our employees to be not safe, or something that has happened. So you could actually turn it around and say, well, if we have 30 reports, it means that we actually have been doing a less safe operation than we planned, because 30 times something could have happened. But you see what I mean? So depending on how we set our goals, people will actually do the behavior, adapt their behavior. And if you say, we strive to have a safe operation and have not any reports at all, well, you know what the outcome will be. 0 reports, because people will not report. But you frame it, the target is framed in a way that it is actually positive not to have any reports. Will that define safety? That's the question, you know? So it is really important when you define safety performance target is to think about how it will actually influence the behavior of the people. And when you set a target, people will try to achieve the target. What does that mean? So also, when you set a target, what is your acceptable level of risk? What is your acceptable level of safety? We all know that we will not have a perfect operation. That's obvious. We all know that an accident may happen, and probably, unfortunately, will happen. The question is, in what way? Okay, if we cut our finger a little bit, it is an accident technically, but is it really bad? No. If we have an accident where an airplane crashes with 20 people dead, it is an accident, and it's a bad accident, obviously. So it's not the same. We will have accidents. What we want to achieve is to reduce the big ones, or to eliminate the big ones and deal with the smaller ones. But the question again is, how can we measure that? How can we actually set up a proper target for that? Now, when you look at safety performance targets, important, as I mentioned, it will drive people. It will drive their behavior. If you have safety performance indicator that help people to do their job better and safer, they will actually follow it. If they understand it, it's easier. So when you say you do spot checks on where people work, and you say we all have protective glasses on, okay? well, then you can say 100% protective glasses. And that is a clear link to the safety in the work environment. People will understand that. And if you go out and you check and people do not have safety glasses on, well, your indicator is lagging, obviously. It gives you a clear indication that something is not working. Then actually, if you have this clear goal, people will know what is right and what is wrong. And they will be able to follow these guidelines and rules. So a safety performance target will help people to do a better job. Now, if you say, if a safety performance indicator is clearly linked to safety, it's easier, but it may not always be. So because over time, the way we do things, the way we process things, some of these safety performance indicators may get out of date, or they may not measure the actual way how we do something. Digitalization and the transforming into more and more in electronic format, things associated with that, and that needs to be taken into consideration, because the process, how we deal with information, how we report, how the processes are done, that might change because we have introduced electronic aids. All right. Also, if you have a safety performance indicator, you need to be able to spread them across the organization. And these targets, the safety performance target, should not just cover flight operation. Yeah, they should also cover other parts as well. Because then, if you just focus on one area, you might miss others. Safety performance target and indicators should be clear. That's why I said it's important to have this kind of sheet for each indicator where you clearly define these points. If you have targets, when we look at the Safety Protective Act glasses, yes, they do encourage desired behavior. They do encourage to be more safe. Have call outs before landing or takeoff, where you know that if you do these call outs, you will not forget major items. That will certainly increase safety. It will increase the behavior of the crew of performing a perfect takeoff, or a good takeoff, let's put it that way. Then you need to have targets that can be achievable. If you set your goals too high, people will be frustrated. If you say we will have zero accidents, look, everybody knows that this is not going to happen. And that frustrates people if you don't achieve that. That is important as well. All right, so now we have defined the identified safety performance indicators. We have defined them, we have set targets. Now, how do we measure that? Well, basically, again, it's baseline performance. So we need to set a baseline. We say, this is where we start. We have now, when we do several spot checks, we have 70% of the people that wear safety glasses, all right? Baseline performance. Now we can then go up and say, okay, let's continue with this, all right? So now we want to go to 80%. So that's how we can define the targets. Now, we also have to make sure that we have triggers identified. Means we need to make sure that we are able to say what is breach, okay? And this is where we come back to the James Reason Swiss cheese method. If we breach one of these borders here, that's like a safety breach. That's when we go through a hole in the Swiss cheese. If we have a lot of data, we can use a statistical method. A standard deviation might be a thing. If we have one standard deviation, that's okay. If we have two, we're way out of line, okay? But also we can say, if we look at safety glasses, now our baseline performance is 70%. If we go below 65%, we will need to increase the checks, and also we have to enforce more stringently that people wear safety glasses. All right, good. One thing also is that we are looking at different type of data for you. If you set this thing up, there's numerous sources that you can use, and some examples where you can actually within your organization. So in an ATO, mandatory recurrence reports, risk assessment registers, training data, etc., etc. So this should give you this kind of complete picture. So those are from within the organization. And then there's also third-party organizations that do provide information. Have a look at that as well. So where else can you get data? Can you do benchmarking? Can you compare your performance with that of another company? If you connect with other people, with other safety managers, well, you might be able to start exchanging ideas, because eventually safety is not about competition. Safety is about safety. And I think it makes sense to be able to exchange that data. All right, so let's see here. Once we have started with the system, once we have the data, we have collected it, we need to analyze it. So we then actually you see that target here is achieved, that target is achieved as well. Okay, so that's the objective, the safety objective. Now, we have to monitor this over time to make sure that we are still on track, which is here. Yes, the downward trend continues, but what about if that changes? How much will we allow it to deviate up here? What happens if it goes down here? So we need to be continuously monitoring that data and analyzing what the reasons of any deviations are. And believe me, there will be deviations. How do we treat them? Is it something out of the ordinary, or is it within the framework, within the bandwidth that we can accept? Something that you'll have to see. All right. So the basic process is, what is happening? Okay. What's the potential explanation, possible explanation that we have the deviation? Okay. We need to make any decisions. How can we do that? Do we need additional information? Do we need to change something? So that's the basic process where you can actually start to do the change. And then you need to implement the change. Then we start this reiterative process. So you communicate. Remember, we look at that process. We also have the safety promotion part. And then that's how we start to implement the changes. We communicate the safety issue. We communicate the proper behavior, how we want to monitor proper behavior. That's implementing the changes. And then making sure that the changes are actually implemented. So that is where the collaboration with line management comes into place, because you as a safety manager or responsible for safety, you will not be able to drive these programs without the support from the people who are actually the boss of the people who need to change. So it takes commitment from management. At the same time, you should think about, do we need to update the safety performance indicator and targets? Are we actually do we still have the right indicators? Do we still have the right targets? Or do we need to adapt them based on what we have learned? All right, and finally, what can you do? I think, first of all, it's data. We need to understand that a safety management system without any data cannot be set up. It's not possible. The question is, what do we measure? And so when you look at the setup of safety management system, being able to have indicators, targets, being able to measure is key for a safety management system. Try to get qualitative data to make sense of the quantitative data. Make it as easy as possible to report. Provide feedback to the people who do report, because then they will report again. If they don't get any feedback at all, they will say, well, it's not for nothing anyway, okay? And try to share your know-how with other safety managers. I think that kind of network will provide significant insights. If you have something that has happened to you and you cannot make sense of it, it's an isolated event. But if you talk to another safety manager and he says, yeah, I had that too, well, it's already a second time that this has happened. So the event, the likelihood of the event that it will happen has increased by 100%. So it has doubled basically. So this is really important for your evaluation as well. So try to exchange. All right. Wow, a lot of information. That's basically the core of, you know, what safety performance indicator, targets, and measurement is about. I give you some occasions if you want to talk with me about the way you want to implement it in your organization. Send me an email, set up a call. We'll talk about that, and also how can you use the data. There's a number of ways to do that. You certainly have your own way already, so so let me know.